Hello fellow cultists and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be doing a top 10 list as per demand of all of you who voted. Thanks so much to all of you, and hopefully this internet issue will be solved relatively soon so I can get back to actual gaming content. But today we're going to be doing my top 10 favorite tanks in War Thunder. Now these are not my favorite 10 tanks of all time. That's an entirely separate list, although some of them would be the same, just in different orders. This is my 10 favorite tanks to play in the game. So without further ado, let's get right into the list. Number 10. At number 10, of course, we have the FCM36, or the Cone. Now I know some of you may have been expecting this to be number 1, but in reality, this is actually not my favorite tank to play in the game. I do still enjoy playing it. I feel like it would be criminal to not have it on the list somewhere, but there are tanks that I actually prefer to play over this one, even though I absolutely adore the Cone. Number 9. At number 9, we have the Whirlwind. If you were around back in the olden days of my channel, you will remember this as being sort of the staple of my channel. The Whirlwind was my sort of branding that I used to use back before I swapped over to the Cone. And as would come with that, it's actually my most played vehicle of all time in the game by a considerable margin. What I've always liked about playing the Whirlwind is just the fact that it's really a jack-of-all-trades vehicle. Now I know a lot of people feel that it's very overpowered, and I do agree that it is definitely under-tiered, but it's still just a very, very fun tank to play, and I don't really play it enough anymore, but whenever I do, I always enjoy playing my Whirlwind. Number 8. Next up, we have the Tiger P, or the Porsche Tiger. This has got to be one of my favorite heavy tanks to play in the game because of how little people understand the weak spots on this tank. Nobody understands that you could just shoot these positions here or the turret face and they just donk shots straight into this front plate, which if you're not aware, that front plate is, it may seem like 100 millimeters, but that's 100 millimeters on top of 100 millimeters. So when you're actually looking at this, the effective thickness is well over 200 millimeters of armor, and at 5'7", there is very little that is going to be able to penetrate that easily. So it can be extremely fun to troll people who are a little bit less knowledgeable about armor placement. That and the uniqueness of the way that this vehicle is propelled and everything just really cements it as one of my favorite tanks to play. Number 7. Next up is the M48. Now this would have been specifically the G model, but the G model got quote buffed a while back and it got raised to 8.3 and given a dart round, which completely made that thing terrible to play, and I absolutely despise playing that thing now. But the standard M48 is still very, very fun and enjoyable for me to play, and it's kind of one of my go-tos, especially the German M48, although that thing should really go back up to 7.3. Like, what's going on with that, Gaijin? And it's just one of my go-to vehicles whenever I'm sort of looking for something to play and can't decide on anything else. Number 6. Next up on my list of tanks is, of course, the Chonky Mouse. I absolutely love playing my mouse, and even though it's been removed from the game, it has not been removed from the number 6 position on my list. Number 5. Coming in at the halfway point on our list is the Ferdinand, and I know what you're thinking, oh, another German vehicle? This is the last one that's on my list. But I had to include the Ferdinand. Between playing this thing in Sim and in RB, it is one of my favorite vehicles to play because that frontal armor, like with the Tiger P, is just absolutely troll. People don't understand that they can shoot the lower plate in these two positions and they just shoot you in this huge upper area, the superstructure rather, and these plates here, which are incredibly thick. And basically anything short of British Sabo and some French rounds are never going to pen that. Coupled with the fact that this thing has a buffed reload that allows you to out-reload basically anything that you face, with the exception of, again, British and French vehicles, you can make mincemeat out of the opposition, and is why the Ferdinand sits at number 5. Number 4. Up next on my list is a tank that I feel is quite underappreciated, like some of the other vehicles on this list, the Object 268. This tank, although it doesn't have the best penetration or the best speed out of the other vehicles at 7.3, what it lacks in those, it makes up for in sheer Russian bias. This thing sits on the hull of a T10M, which gives it pretty decent maneuverability. Granted, it's not super fast, but it has decent mobility coupled with one of the best derp guns, I would say, in the game. Now, granted, you don't have to fire the HE out of this gun, because the APHE, although it only has 230 millimeters of pen, it has better normalization and actual effective pen than a lot of other big guns like it. I'm not entirely certain why. Gaijin's penetration calculator is sometimes just a mystery to me, but this thing is so fun to play. You have very little difficulty penning most of the stuff that you face, and when you pen them, they usually die. And even if they don't, you actually have a pretty decent reload in this thing at around 18 seconds, which is considerably faster than the other big gunned Russian tanks. And even if you don't reload in time, nobody knows how to kill these things because nobody plays it. It's shoot here, by the way, if you're wondering. So they just ricochet off of your extremely well-angled and thick armor, and it just makes this thing so much fun to play. And I actually regret the fact that I'm pretty much done spading 7.3 Russia because I don't play it as much as I used to. Number 3. At the number 3 spot, we have another tank that I feel is a bit underappreciated, the T62M1. Now, you may have seen that I made a video on this thing recently in Sim, and most of my impressions of this thing have been from Sim. Granted, it is going to be moving down to 8.7 soon, so that might make it even better than it already was. But this thing is very, very fun, and I feel that it's one of the most fun vehicles you can actually play in Sim. The offset of the gun is very, very easy to account for. It gets a laser rangefinder, which in Sim allows you to automatically rangefind, which is basically borderline aimbot. Plus it gets add-on composite armor, and eventually once you get the modification, it gets the little heat screens that sit off on the side. And overall, this thing is just a joy to play. I like the base T62, and this is just a better T62. Number 2. At the number 2 spot, we have another French vehicle, the AMX-30. Now, this is easily my favorite early MBT in the game. I absolutely love 7.7 France, mainly because of this tank. It is just absolutely incredible to play. It has good mobility, a good gun, decent armor, quite good survivability actually, the fuel tank positioning as well as the sloping on this thing. You wouldn't think it from looking at it, but you'll know if you've faced it or if you've played as this thing. It's incredibly bouncy. It doesn't really make any sense sometimes, but it's very, very survivable in a lot of situations. Not to mention, it has a coax 20mm, which can actually elevate higher than the barrel, meaning this thing can deal with helicopters considerably well. And all in all, it's just a very enjoyable tank for me to play, and I would highly recommend you try it if you haven't. Now, as I've mentioned in the past, it is very hard for me to pick favorites, and similarly to, I think it was the Chieftain who said,
I had to tell 195 of my children that I don't love them as much as the other 5, on some random arbitrary measure.
I have a very difficult time picking favorites. So I have a couple other honorable mentions that I would like to include before we get to my number 1 favorite tank to play. The first of my honorable mentions, and we're going to run through these really fast, is the AMX-13, not just specifically the SS-11, but just the AMX-13s in general, the 1390, the standard 13, and the 13 SS11. Absolutely phenomenal light tanks, probably easily my favorite in the game. Up next, another French tank, the Lorraine 40T. This easily would have been my number one a few years ago, but because of upped repair costs and raised BRs, it's really fallen out of favor in my eyes, but I still love my Lorraine. Following that, we also have the T10M, another tank that I recently made a video on. This is a blast to play. I love heavy tanks, and the T10M is basically the ultimate heavy tank that you can get in this game, aside from maybe something like the 279. The final British lad on this list is the Conqueror Mark II. I absolutely adore playing the Conqueror, although it was definitely better at 7.3. And last but not least in my honorable mentions, the little tiny FM43. This thing was probably the highlight of my Swedish tank grind, and it's just an absolute blast to play. I always forget how fun it is whenever I revisit it. Number 1. Coming in at the final spot, my number 1 favorite tank to play in War Thunder currently is my Bat Chat, the Char 25T. This thing has everything that I like in a tank, minus the armor. I am a heavy tank player after all, so it is a little weird that I would pick a light tank to be my top tank, I guess. But this thing has the gun from the AMX M4 on a much more similar to the AMX 13 chassis. Now, granted, I prefer the AMX 13's autoloader, and the AMX 13 and the Bat Chat are very, very, very close in my eyes, but I prefer playing the Bat Chat for a couple reasons. The main one being it's a much more stable gun platform, and the gun feels just a little bit better when you're using it. Now, that's not to take anything away from the AMX 13's gun. That thing is absolutely incredible, especially with the 5-second reload, which is still better than the Bat Chats. But something about the way that this tank drives, whenever I use it, I always feel like I just get in the zone and I can just do so much more than I can in the majority of my French tanks. And the French tanks are some of my favorite in the game. That's why there's so many of them included on this list. And I highly recommend, if you haven't, that you try out the French tank tech tree. It is a little bit difficult to get started, I will admit, but it is well worth the effort. Well, I do hope you guys enjoyed my top 10 tanks in War Thunder. If you'd like to see some more of these videos, maybe my top 10 tanks of all time or top 10s of other sorts, let me know and I'll consider doing them in the future, especially if my internet continues to give me issues. Hopefully I'll have that sorted out so I can be back to doing some gameplay videos in the future. I will see you Wednesday with the next installment of Weeb Wednesdays, where we're finding out what happens when you play too much Eurobeat in a tank factory. But until then, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.